The Ghost in the Cupboard Room. By Wilkie Collins. Mr. Beaver, on being spoke, as his friend and ally, Jack Governor, called it, turned out of an imaginary hammock with the greatest promptitude, and went straight on duty. As it's Nat Beaver's watch, said he, there shall be no skulking. Jack looked at me, with an expectant and admiring turn of his eye on Mr. Beaver, full of complimentary implication. I noticed, by the way, that Jack, in a naval absence of mind with which he is greatly troubled at times, had his arm round my sister's waist. Perhaps this complaint originates in an old nautical requirement of having something to hold on by. These were the terms of Mr. Beaver's revelation to us. What I have got to put forward will not take very long, and I shall beg leave to begin by going back to last night, just about the time when we all parted from one another to go to bed. The members of this good company did a very necessary and customary thing. Last night, they each took a bedroom candlestick and lit the candle before they went upstairs. I wonder whether any one of them noticed that I left my candlestick untouched, and my candle unlighted, and went to bed, in a haunted house, of all the places in the world, in the dark. I don't think any one of them did. That is, perhaps, rather curious to begin with. It is likewise curious, and just as true, that the bare sight of those candlesticks in the hands of this good company set me in a tremble, and made last night a night's bad dream instead of a night's good sleep. The fact of the matter is, and I give you leave, ladies and gentlemen, to laugh at it as much as you please, that the ghost which haunted me last night, which has haunted me off and on for many years past, and which will go on haunting me till I am a ghost myself, and consequently spirit-proof in all respects, is nothing more or less than a bedroom candlestick. Yes, a bedroom candlestick and candle, or a flat candlestick and candle, put it which way you like, that is what haunts me. I wish it was something pleasanter and more out of the common way, a beautiful lady, or a mine of gold and silver, or a cellar of wine, and a coach and horses, and such like. But being what it is, I must take it for what it is, and make the best of it, and I shall thank you all kindly if you will help me out by doing the same. I am not a scholar myself, but I make bold to believe that the haunting of any man, with anything under the sun, begins with the frightening of him. At any rate, the haunting of me with a bedroom candlestick and candle began with the frightening of me with a bedroom candlestick and candle, the frightening of me half out of my life, ladies and gentlemen, and, for the time being, the frightening of me altogether out of my wits. That is not a very pleasant thing to confess to you all, before stating the particulars, but perhaps you will be the readier to believe that I am not a downright coward, because you find me bold enough to make a clean breast of it already, to my own great disadvantage, so far. These are the particulars, as well as I can put them. I was apprenticed to the sea when I was about as tall as my own walking stick, and I made good enough use of my time to be fit for a mate's berth at the age of 25 years. It was in the year 1818, or 19, I am not quite certain which, that I reached the before-mentioned age of 25. You will please to excuse my memory not being very good for dates, names, numbers, places, and such like. No fear, though, about the particulars I have undertaken to tell you of. I have got them all ship-shape in my recollection. I can see them, at this moment, as clear as noonday in my own mind. But there is a mist over what went before, and, for the matter of that, a mist likewise over much that came after, and it's not very likely to lift, at my time of life, is it? Well, in 1818, or 19, when there was peace in our part of the world, and not before it was wanted, you will say, there was fighting, of a certain scampering, scrambling kind, going on in that old fighting ground, which we seafaring men know by the name of the Spanish Main. The possessions that belonged to the Spaniards in South America had broken into open mutiny and declared for themselves years before. There was plenty of bloodshed between the new government and the old, but the new had got the best of it, for the most part, under one General Bolivar, a famous man in his time, though he seems to have dropped out of people's memories now. Englishmen and Irishmen with a turn for fighting, and nothing particular to do at home, joined the General as volunteers, and some of our merchants here found it a good venture to send supplies across the ocean to the popular side. There was risk enough, of course, in doing this, but where one speculation of the kind succeeded, it made up for two, at the least, that failed. And that's the true principle of trade, wherever I have met with it, all the world over. Among the Englishmen who were concerned in this Spanish-American business, I, your humble servant, happened, in a small way, to be one. I was then mate of a brig belonging to a certain firm in the city, which drove a sort of general trade, mostly in queer out-of-the-way places, as far from home as possible, and which freighted the brig, in the year I am speaking of, with a cargo of gunpowder for General Bolivar and his volunteers. Nobody knew anything about our instructions, when we sailed, except the captain, and he didn't half seem to like them. I can't rightly say how many barrels of powder we had on board, or how much each barrel held, I only know we had no other cargo. The name of the brig was the Good Intent, a queer name enough, you will tell me, for a vessel laden with gunpowder, and sent to help a revolution. And as far as this particular voyage was concerned, so it was. I meant that for a joke, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm sorry to find you don't laugh at it. The Good Intent was the craziest old tub of a vessel I ever went to sea in, and the worst found in all respects. She was 230 or 280 tons burden, I forget which, and she had a crew of 8, all told, nothing like as many as we ought by rights to have had to work the brig. However, we were well and honestly paid our wages, and we had to set that against the chance of foundering at sea, and, on this occasion, likewise, the chance of being blown up into the bargain. In consideration of the nature of our cargo, we were harassed with new regulations, which we didn't at all like, relative to smoking our pipes and lighting our lanterns, and, as usual in such cases, the captain who made the regulations preached what he didn't practice. Not a man of us was allowed to have a bit of lighted candle in his hand when he went below, except the skipper, and he used his light when he turned in, or when he looked over his charts on the cabin table, just as usual. This light was a common kitchen candle or dip, of the sort that goes 8 or 10 to the pound, and it stood in an old battered flat candlestick, with all the Japan worn and melted off, and all the tin showing through. It would have been more seamanlike and suitable in every respect if he had had a lamp or a lantern, but he stuck to his old candlestick, and that same old candlestick, ladies and gentlemen, was ever afterward stuck to me. That's another joke, if you like, and I'm much obliged to Miss Belinda in the corner for being good enough to laugh at it. Well, I said well before, but it's a word that helps a man on. Like, we sailed in the brig, and shaped our course, first, for the Virgin Islands, in the West Indies, and, after sighting them, we made for the Leeward Islands next, and then stood on due south, till the lookout at the masthead hailed the deck, and said he saw land. That land was the coast of South America. We had had a wonderful voyage so far. We had lost none of our spars or sails, and not a man of us had been harassed to death at the pumps. It wasn't often the Good Intent made such a voyage as that, I can tell you. I was sent aloft to make sure about the land, and I did make sure of it. When I reported the same to the skipper, he went below, and had a look at his letter of instructions and the chart. When he came on deck again, he altered our course a trifle to the eastward. I forget the point on the compass, but that don't matter. What I do remember is, that it was dark before we closed in with the land. We kept the lead going, and hove the brig to in from 4 to 5 fathoms water, or it might be 6, I can't say for certain. I kept a sharp eye to the drift of the vessel, none of us knowing how the currents ran on that coast. We all wondered why the skipper didn't anchor, but he said, no, he must first show a light at the fore masthead, and wait for an answering light on shore. We did wait, and nothing of the sort appeared. It was starlight and calm. What little wind there was came in puffs off the land. I suppose we waited, drifting a little to the westward, as I made it out, best part of an hour before anything happened, and then, instead of seeing the light on shore, we saw a boat coming towards us, rowed by 2 men only. We hailed them, and they answered, friends, and hailed us by our name. They came on board. One of them was an Irishman, and the other was a coffee-colored native pilot, who jabbered a little English. The Irishman handed a note to our skipper, who showed it to me. It informed us that the part of the coast we were off then was not over safe for discharging our cargo, seeing that spies of the enemy, that is to say, of the old government, had been taken and shot in the neighborhood the day before. We might trust the brig to the native pilot, and he had his instructions to take us to another part of the coast. The note was signed by the proper parties, so we let the Irishman go back alone in the boat, and allowed the pilot to exercise his lawful authority over the brig. He kept us stretching off from the land till noon the next day, his instructions, seemingly, ordering him to keep us well out of sight of the shore. We only altered our course, in the afternoon, so as to close in with the land again a little before midnight. This same pilot was about as ill-looking a vagabond as ever I saw, a skinny, cowardly, quarrelsome mongrel, who swore at the men, in the vilest broken English, till they were every one them ready to pitch him over. The skipper kept them quiet, and I kept them quiet, for the pilot being given us by our instructions, we were bound to make the best of him. Near nightfall, however, with the best will in the world to avoid it, I was unlucky enough to quarrel with him. He wanted to go below with his pipe, and I stopped him, of course, because it was contrary to orders. Upon that, he tried to hustle by me, and I put him away with my hand. I never meant to push him down, but, somehow, I did. He picked himself up as quick as lightning, and pulled out his knife. I snatched it out of his hand, slapped his murderous face for him, and threw his weapon overboard. He gave me one ugly look, and walked aft. I didn't think much of the look then, but I remembered it a little too well afterwards. We were close in with the land again, just as the wind failed us, between 11 and 12 that night, and dropped our anchor by the pilot's directions. It was pitch dark, and a dead, airless calm. The skipper was on deck with 2 of our best men for watch. The rest were below, except the pilot, who coiled himself up, more like a snake than a man, on the forecastle. It was not my watch till 4 in the morning. But I didn't like the look of the night, or the pilot, or the state of things generally, and I shook myself down on deck to get my nap there, and be ready for anything at a moment's notice. The last I remember was the skipper whispering to me that he didn't like the look of things either, and that he would go below and consult his instructions again. That is the last I remember, before the slow, heavy, regular roll of the old brig on the ground swell rocked me off to sleep. I was woke, ladies and gentlemen, by a scuffle on the forecastle, and a gag in my mouth. There was a man on my breast and a man on my legs, and I was bound hand and foot in half a minute. The brig was in the hands of the Spaniards. They were swarming all over her. I heard 6 heavy splashes in the water, one after another. I saw the captain stabbed to the heart as he came running up the companion, and I heard a 7th splash in the water. Except myself, every soul of us on board had been murdered and thrown into the sea. Why I was left, I couldn't think, till I saw the pilot stoop over me with a lantern, and look, to make sure of who I was. There was a devilish grin on his face, and he nodded his head at me, as much as to say, you were the man who hustled me down and slapped my face, and I mean to play the game of cat and mouse with you in return for it. I could neither move nor speak, but I could see the Spaniards take off the main hatch and rig the purchases for getting up the cargo. A quarter of an hour afterwards, I heard the sweeps of a schooner, or other small vessel, in the water. The strange craft was laid alongside of us, and the Spaniards set to work to discharge our cargo into her. They all worked hard except the pilot, and he came, from time to time, with his lantern, to have another look at me, and to grin and nod always in the same devilish way. I am old enough now not to be ashamed of confessing the truth, and I don't mind acknowledging that the pilot frightened me. The fright, and the bonds, and the gag, and the not being able to stir hand or foot, had pretty nigh worn me out, by the time the Spaniards gave over work. This was just as the dawn broke. They had shifted good part of our cargo on board their vessel, but nothing like all of it, and they were sharp enough to be off with what they had got, before daylight. I need hardly say that I had made up my mind, by this time, to the worst I could think of. The pilot, it was clear enough, was one of the spies of the enemy, who had wormed himself into the confidence of our consignees without being suspected. He, or more likely his employers, had got knowledge enough of us to suspect what our cargo was. We had been anchored for the night in the safest berth for them to surprise us in, and we had paid the penalty of having a small crew, and consequently an insufficient watch. All this was clear enough, but what did the pilot mean to do with me? On the word of a man, it makes my flesh creep, now, only to tell you what he did with me. After all the rest of them were out of the brig, except the pilot and 2 Spanish seamen, these last took me up, bound and gagged as I was, lowered me into the hold of the vessel, and laid me along on the floor, lashing me to it with rope's ends, so that I could just turn from one side to the other, but could not roll myself fairly over, so as to change my place. They then left me. Both of them were the worse for liquor, but the devil of a pilot was sober, mind that. As sober as I am at the present moment. I lay in the dark for a little while, with my heart thumping as if it was going to jump out of me. I lay about 5 minutes so, when the pilot came down into the hold, alone. He had the captain's cursed flat candlestick and a carpenter's awl in one hand, and a long thin twist of cotton yarn, well oiled, in the other. He put the candlestick, with a new dip lighted in it, down on the floor, about 2 feet from my face, and close against the side of the vessel. The light was feeble enough, but it was sufficient to show a dozen barrels of gunpowder or more, left all round me in the hold of the brig. I began to suspect what he was after, the moment I noticed the barrels. The horrors laid hold of me from head to foot, and the sweat poured off my face like water. I saw him go, next, to one of the barrels of powder standing against the side of the vessel, in a line with the candle, and about 3 feet, or rather better, away from it. He bored a hole in the side of the barrel with his awl, and the horrid powder came trickling out, as black as hell, and dripped into the hollow of his hand, which he held to catch it. When he had got a good handful, he stopped up the hole by jamming one end of his oiled twist of cotton yarn fast into it, and he then rubbed the powder into the whole length of the yarn, till he had blackened every hair's breadth of it. The next thing he did, as true as I sit here, as true as the heaven above us all, the next thing he did was to carry the free end of his long, lean, black, frightful slow match to the lighted candle alongside my face, and to tie it, in several folds, round the tallow dip, about 1/3 of the distance down, measuring from the flame of the wick to the lip of the candlestick. He did that, he looked to see that my lashings were all safe, and then he put his face down close to mine, and whispered in my ear, "Blow up with the brig." He was on deck again the moment after, and he and the 2 others shoved the hatch on over me. At the farthest end from where I lay, they had not fitted it down quite true, and I saw a blink of daylight glimmering in when I looked in that direction. I heard the sweeps of the schooner fall into the water, splash! Splash! Fainter and fainter, as they swept the vessel out in the dead calm, to be ready for the wind in the offing. Fainter and fainter, splash! Splash! For 1/4 of an hour or more. While those sounds were in my ears, my eyes were fixed on the candle. It had been freshly lit, if left to itself it would burn for between 6 and 7 hours, the slow match was twisted round it about 1/3 of the way down, and therefore the flame would be about 2 hours reaching it. There I lay, gagged, bound, lashed to the floor, seeing my own life burning down with the candle by my side. There I lay, alone on the sea, doomed to be blown to atoms, and to see that doom drawing on, nearer and nearer with every fresh second of time, through nigh on 2 hours to come, powerless to help myself and speechless to call for help to others. The wonder to me is that I didn't cheat the flame, the slow match, and the powder, and die of the horror of my situation before my first half hour was out in the hold of the brig. I can't exactly say how long I kept the command of my senses after I had ceased to hear the splash of the schooner's sweeps in the water. I can trace back everything I did and everything I thought, up to a certain point, but once past that, I get all abroad, and lose myself in my memory now, much as I lost myself in my own feelings at the time. The moment the hatch was covered over me, I began, as every other man would have begun in my place, with a frantic effort to free my hands. In the mad panic I was in, I cut my flesh with the lashings as if they had been knife blades, but I never stirred them. There was less chance still of freeing my legs, or of tearing myself from the fastenings that held me to the floor. I gave in, when I was all but suffocated for want of breath. The gag, you will please to remember, was a terrible enemy to me. I could only breathe freely through my nose, and that is but a poor vent when a man is straining his strength as far as ever it will go. I gave in, and lay quiet, and got my breath again, my eyes glaring and straining at the candle all the time. While I was staring at it, the notion struck me of trying to blow out the candle by pumping a long breath at it suddenly through my nostrils. It was too high above me, and too far away from me, to be reached in that fashion. I tried, and tried, and tried, and then I gave in again, and lay quiet again, always with my eyes glaring at the candle and the candle glaring at me. The splash of the schooner's sweeps was very faint by this time. I could only just hear them in the morning stillness. Splash! Splash! Fainter and fainter, splash! Splash! Without exactly feeling my mind going, I began to feel it getting queer, as early as this. The snuff of the candle was growing taller and taller, and the length of tallow between the flame and the slow match, which was the length of my life, was getting shorter and shorter. I calculated that I had rather less than an hour and a half to live. An hour and a half! Was there a chance, in that time, of a boat pulling off to the brig from shore? Whether the land near which the vessel was anchored was in possession of our side, or in possession of the enemy's side, I made it out that they must, sooner or later, send to hail the brig, merely because she was a stranger in those parts. The question for me was, how soon? The sun had not risen yet, as I could tell by looking through the chink in the hatch. There was no coast village near us, as we all knew, before the brig was seized, by seeing no lights on shore. There was no wind, as I could tell by listening, to bring any strange vessel near. If I had had 6 hours to live, there might have been a chance for me, reckoning from sunrise to noon. But with an hour and a half, which had dwindled to an hour and a quarter by this time, or, in other words, with the earliness of the morning, the uninhabited coast, and the dead calm all against me, there was not the ghost of a chance. As I felt that, I had another struggle, the last, with my bonds, and only cut myself the deeper for my pains. I gave in once more, and lay quiet, and listened for the splash of the sweeps. Gone! Not a sound could I hear but the blowing of a fish, now and then, on the surface of the sea, and the creak of the brig's crazy old spars, as she rolled gently from side to side with the little swell there was on the quiet water. An hour and a quarter. The wick grew terribly, as the quarter slipped away, and the charred top of it began to thicken and spread out mushroom shape. It would fall off soon. Would it fall off red hot, and would the swing of the brig kent it over the side of the candle and let it down on the slow match? If it would, I had about 10 minutes to live instead of an hour. This discovery set my mind for a minute on a new tack altogether. I began to ponder with myself what sort of a death blowing up might be. Painful? Well, it would be, surely, too sudden for that. Perhaps just one crash, inside me, or outside me, or both, and nothing more? Perhaps not even a crash, that and death and the scattering of this living body of mine into millions of fiery sparks, might all happen in the same instant? I couldn't make it out, I couldn't settle how it would be. The minute of calmness in my mind left it, before I had half done thinking, and I got all abroad again. When I came back to my thoughts, or when they came back to me, I can't say which, the wick was awfully tall, the flame was burning with a smoke above it, the charred top was broad and red, and heavily spreading out to its fall. My despair and horror at seeing it took me in a new way, which was good and right, at any rate, for my poor soul. I tried to pray, in my own heart, you will understand, for the gag put all lip praying out of my power. I tried, but the candle seemed to burn it up in me. I struggled hard to force my eyes from the slow, murdering flame, and to look up through the chink in the hatch at the blessed daylight. I tried once, tried twice, and gave it up. I tried next only to shut my eyes, and keep them shut, once, twice, and the second time I did it. God bless old mother, and sister Lizzie, God keep them both, and forgive me. That was all I had time to say, in my own heart, before my eyes opened again, in spite of me, and the flame of the candle flew into them, flew all over me, and burnt up the rest of my thoughts in an instant. I couldn't hear the fish blowing now, I couldn't hear the creak of the spars, I couldn't think, I couldn't feel the sweat of my own death agony on my face, I could only look at the heavy, charred top of the wick. It swelled, tottered, bent over to one side, dropped red hot at the moment of its fall, black and harmless, even before the swing of the brig had canted it over into the bottom of the candlestick. I caught myself laughing. Yes, laughing at the safe fall of the bit of wick. But for the gag I should have screamed with laughing. As it was, I shook with it inside me, shook till the blood was in my head, and I was all but suffocated for want of breath. I had just sense enough left to feel that my own horrid laughter, at that awful moment, was a sign of my brain going at last. I had just sense enough left to make another struggle before my mind broke loose like a frightened horse, and ran away with me. One comforting look at the blink of daylight through the hatch was what I tried for once more. The fight to force my eyes from the candle and to get that one look at the daylight was the hardest I had had yet, and I lost the fight. The flame had hold of my eyes as fast as the lashings had hold of my hands. I couldn't look away from it. I couldn't even shut my eyes, when I tried that next, for the second time. There was the wick, growing tall once more. There was the space of unburnt candle between the light and the slow match, shortened to an inch or less. How much life did that inch leave me? 3/4 of an hour? Half an hour? 50 minutes? 20 minutes? Steady! An inch of tallow candle would burn longer than 20 minutes. An inch of tallow! The notion of a man's body and soul being kept together by an inch of tallow. Wonderful! Why, the greatest king that sits on a throne can't keep a man's body and soul together, and here's an inch of tallow that can do what the king can't. There's something to tell mother when I get home, which will surprise her more than all the rest of my voyages put together. I laughed inwardly, again, at the thought of that, and shook and swelled and suffocated myself, till the light of the candle leaped in through my eyes, and licked up the laughter, and burnt it out of me, and made me all empty, and cold, and quiet once more. Mother and Lizzie. I don't know when they came back, but they did come back, not, as it seemed to me, into my mind this time, but right down bodily before me, in the hold of the brig. Yes, sure enough, there was Lizzie, just as light-hearted as usual, laughing at me. Laughing? Well, why not? Who is to blame Lizzie for thinking I'm lying on my back, drunk in the cellar, with the beer barrels all round me? Steady! She's crying now, spinning round and round in a fiery mist, wringing her hands, screeching out for help, fainter and fainter, like the splash of the schooner's sweeps. Gone! Burnt up in the fiery mist. Mist? Fire? No, neither one nor the other. Its mother makes the light, mother knitting, with 10 flaming points at the ends of her fingers and thumbs, and slow matches hanging in bunches all round her face instead of her own grey hair. Mother in her old armchair, and the pilot's long skinny hands hanging over the back of the chair, dripping with gunpowder. No. No gunpowder, no chair, no mother, nothing but the pilot's face, shining red hot, like a sun, in the fiery mist, turning upside down in the fiery mist, running backwards and forwards along the slow match, in the fiery mist, spinning millions of miles in a minute, in the fiery mist, spinning itself smaller and smaller into one tiny point, and that point darting on a sudden straight into my head, and then, all fire and all mist, no hearing, no seeing, no thinking, no feeling, the brig, the sea, my own self, the whole world, all gone together. After what I've just told you, I know nothing and remember nothing, till I woke up, as it seemed to me, in a comfortable bed, with two rough and ready men like myself sitting on each side of my pillow, and a gentleman standing watching me at the foot of the bed. It was about 7 in the morning. My sleep, or what seemed like my sleep to me, had lasted better than 8 months. I was among my own countrymen in the island of Trinidad. The men at each side of my pillow were my keepers, turn and turn about, and the gentleman standing at the foot of the bed was the doctor. What I said and did in those 8 months, I never have known and never shall. I woke out of it, as if it had been one long sleep, that's all I know. It was another 2 months or more before the doctor thought it safe to answer the questions I asked him. The brig had been anchored, just as I had supposed, off a part of the coast which was lonely enough to make the Spaniards pretty sure of no interruption, so long as they managed their murderous work quietly under cover of night. My life had not been saved from the shore, but from the sea. An American vessel, becalmed in the offing, had made out the brig as the sun rose, and the captain, having his time on his hands in consequence of the calm, and seeing a vessel anchored where no vessel had any reason to be, had manned one of his boats and sent his mate with it, to look a little closer into the matter, and bring back a report of what he saw. What he saw, when he and his men found the brig deserted and boarded her, was a gleam of candlelight through the chink in the hatchway. The flame was within about a thread's breadth of the low match, when he lowered himself into the hold, and if he had not had the sense and coolness to cut the match in two with his knife, before he touched the candle, he and his men might have been blown up along with the brig, as well as me. The match caught and turned into sputtering red fire, in the very act of putting the candle out, and if the communication with the powder barrel had not been cut off, the Lord only knows what might have happened. What became of the Spanish schooner and the pilot I have never heard from that day to this. As for the brig, the Yankees took her, as they took me, to Trinidad, and claimed their salvage, and got it, I hope, for their own sakes. I was landed just in the same state as when they rescued me from the brig, that is to say, clean out of my senses. But, please to remember, it was a long time ago, and, take my word for it, I was discharged cured, as I have told you. Bless your hearts, I'm all right now, as you may see. I'm a little shaken by telling the story, ladies and gentlemen, a little shaken, that's all.